We are looking forward to celebrating homecoming together next week. I'm thrilled that we have the opportunity to hear from Pastor Michael Barrett. Pastor Mike served here faithfully 31 years. What many of you may not have the opportunity to see as often as some of us as a staff, Mike's still a vital part of our church body. He's a member here at Pleasant Garden while he's serving our churches all across our association, directing our Piedmont Baptist Association. He's still invested in helping care for many of those in our church family go through seasons of difficulty. Pastor Mike and I have overlapped a number of funerals across these first 4 years, and we're privileged to have him back with us as part of homecoming celebration next Sunday. We also have some special musical guests as a part of next Sunday's homecoming celebration. I've got a picture I want to put up on the screen. Some of y'all may recognize these guys. And if you're not entirely sure who that is, let me put up another picture and point out two of our very own staff members. David Marth and Jonathan Lawson. This is the group, by his grace, that got their start here at Pleasant Garden a number of years ago. Now, we've not yet been able to pin down whether they're coming out of retirement or whether this is just a one-time thing. But we are going to have those guys as part of our homecoming celebration next Sunday. Looking forward to fellowship together, looking forward to encouragement in the Word, and looking forward to these guys leading us in worship. As Pastor Marty mentioned, a little bit different Sunday, especially as we're finishing out the morning. We're going to be rolling straight into a meal. We appreciate in advance all of you right now here in this sanctuary will be a part of helping with next Sunday's celebration and fun. And we're looking forward to the privilege God gives us to be together next Sunday for homecoming. This morning, we're gonna do things a little bit different than in this message than we typically do. It's one of the reasons I put a handout together for us. On the front half of our message, the first half of our time together, I'm going to talk about some big terms that are connected to eschatology and the doctrine of the end times, and some of the ways we come to the book of Revelation, and some land a little bit differently or disagree about how best to make sense of this beautiful and majestic and mysterious and symbolic book. And then as we finish the time together, we're going to focus in on what we can do with some of those differences. Practically, what does that mean for us? The reality is Revelation is a beautiful book, but that doesn't mean it's not a complicated book. And when we start into chapters 4 through 22 particularly, we're going to see a whole lot of imagery and symbolism that makes it complicated for us to always agree with one another on how best to interpret it. There are a number of places in the book of Revelation where well-meaning people, studied people, biblical people, godly people are going to land and interpret some of the book differently. That's why one pastor who was asked a number of years ago what his position on the millennial views, Jesus' 1,000-year millennial reign, it's talked about later in the book of Revelation. There's a couple of different views on that, and we're going to talk through those here in just a couple of minutes. But one pastor was asked what his millennial view was, and he said, "I'm a pan-millennialist." And the person who asked him said, "Well, what does that mean?" The pastor responded, "I just believe it's all going to pan out in the end." Listen, there's some wisdom in that. When we come to the prophetic future, for that matter, let me just remind us of something up front. When we come to the future in any way, do you realize we don't have the ability to predict it? We might think there are some things that are going to unfold. For instance, election day is the first Tuesday in November every 2 years, and some roles are elected every 4 years. We know that's coming, but we don't know what the outcome of that day is going to be. We don't have the ability to predict the future. And what it's important for us as God's people to do as we navigate the preparations for the future is that we keep our perspectives on the book of Revelation and on the end times and on what we hold to, that we keep that grounded in the Scriptures. Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. A verse I read last week, a verse I want to remind us of again. It's the baseline for what we addressed last Sunday and we're going to address this Sunday. And I want to say this up front to all of us again as a loud reminder. We may not have the ability to predict the future or to crystallize or concretely know times or dates, but here's what we do know. Jesus is coming back. Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. Listen again to the text. John's words to the churches in turmoil in the ancient world. Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, amen. Jesus is coming back. Now, because of the nature of this book, and we spent some time pretty early on in this series reminding ourselves of the symbolism and the complexity and the beauty of Revelation, because of those factors that John included in how he wrote the visions that God gave him, people down through the centuries have landed on how best to make sense of this book in different ways. There's basically three different areas of disagreement I want to work through here for just a couple of minutes at the front end of the message. And I want to remind us, before I do, what we highlighted last Sunday. The theological triage. There are some doctrines that distinguish us as believers from non-believers. They're the most important doctrines. The doctrines about Jesus and salvation and the authority of the Scriptures. And then there are second-level doctrines that distinguish us from other churches, like baptism or the Lord's Supper. And then there are third-level doctrines. There are doctrines where you and I may disagree with one another and yet be in the same body and be able to continue to operate in unity. And everything I'm going to talk about this morning, I believe, lands in that third category of a third-level doctrine. It's important. My goal in this series and my goal this morning is not to change your eschatology, but it is to remind us of where to place it in the scale of how we understand what God teaches us and how we best make sense of this book. So with that said, let me move pretty quickly through a couple of areas when you come to the book of Revelation, a couple of areas where there's disagreement. What you're going to see on the screens is a thinned down version of what's on the handout and what's on the app. So if you like to write and take notes, you're more than welcome to write everything up there, but you can also pick up a sheet that's got it all there for you. Three areas of disagreement when we approach the book of Revelation. Here's the first one. The first main area. Disagreement exists on how best to interpret the book as a whole. There are at least four main ways people tend to approach the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapters 1 through chapters 22, how do you make sense of the book as a whole? At least four main ways. The first one being the view of the person who's a preterist. A person who believes this particular way of interpreting Revelation essentially teaches or believes that everything in Revelation happened in the first century. John most likely wrote Revelation somewhere in the 90s AD. A person who holds to this view believes that everything that John wrote, all the way up into the things that the text tells us will happen hereafter, chapter 4 and following. A person who interprets the book of Revelation this way believes all that took place in the first century. So everything that was unfolding in the book of Revelation that talks about the Antichrist and the beast and the judgments was all wrapped around the first century world and the Roman Empire. It's the first main way many people tend to approach the book of Revelation. A second way people tend to approach the book of Revelation as a whole, how to make sense of the book, is a historicist approach. Where this differs from those who would be preterists, they believe that everything that's happened in Revelation has happened up through history past. So for instance, if someone was a historicist and they lived in the 1500s, they would believe that everything that Revelation has given us happened up until their point in time in history. So it's all happened in the past. And third view, you see that there on the screen, is a futurist view, particularly chapters 4 through 22. I would say the majority of us in this room, perhaps the majority of Baptists across our nation, would land somewhere in this third view, a futurist view. When you get to chapter 4, verse 1, you see John receiving a revelation from Jesus and from the angel that's sent to be the messenger on God's behalf. And it says, come and see the things which are to happen hereafter. It appears to most of us when we read Revelation and read the events in chapters 4 through 22 that a lot of these events have yet to appear to have taken place. That's the futurist view. And the fourth view is the idealist view. You're going to notice in a couple of these areas of disagreement, there's some safe landing places for the Premillennialists. You know, those folks that are just going to be like, hey, you know what? I'm not going to be too concrete about anything I believe about Revelation. I'm going to have a kind of a safe box, if you will. That's the idealist view. Not attempting to interpret Revelation very concretely, very comfortable with interpreting Revelation symbolically, and drawing from the book some of the principles and lessons for living in the here and now. For instance, the majority of us, and I'm just going to go ahead and share with you, my plan as we work through this book is to approach Revelation as a blend of the futurist view and the historicist view. Or excuse me, the futurist view and the idealist view. I believe we draw key principles for how we live, and I believe much of what Revelation has yet to take place. It's a blending of these two approaches to the book. And yet there are areas, there are places where people disagree. For instance, one of my best friends for a number of years was a preterist. He believed strongly that everything that happened in Revelation happened all in the first century. He was a godly friend. He was a very well-read student of the Scriptures. Every time I was around him, he had a stack of books, and he committed himself to that particular view. I'll come back to that in a few minutes here as we get to some principles to wrap this up. That's one area of disagreement. How do we approach the book as a whole? There's another place when you work down into the details of the book of Revelation where people often disagree. And that's how do we make sense of the millennial reign of Jesus? What are the views on the different approaches to the 1,000-year reign? Now, I mentioned this term, the millennial reign of Jesus, in the first service, and I had a church member remind me afterwards, Pastor, you should probably clarify, you're not talking about the millennials. And I'm not. I'm not talking about Gen X, not talking about the millennials. It's not a term for a certain group based on a certain age range. In the book of Revelation, there's a section toward the end of the book that talks about Jesus returning and setting up a 1,000-year period of time called the millennial reign. There are a couple of different ways people have made sense of that particular section of Revelation. For instance, there are those who, over a century ago, the post-millennial view was very strong. As the 1800s gave way into the early 1900s and the Industrial Revolution was strong and you were seeing revivals and the gospel was spreading across this country and across parts of Europe, there was a tremendous amount of hope that the world was going to just continue to get better and better and better. And the postmillennial view took its shape during that season of history when people had a very positive outlook about the future. And the postmillennial view basically teaches or taught that believers would evangelize the world into the beauty of Jesus' return. That God would work through His church in such a powerful way that people would continue to come to Christ and the millennial reign would happen before Jesus came back. It's the postmillennial view. But a couple of factors kind of weakened the confidence many people have had in that. World War I and World War II. And now, decades on the other side of both of those conflicts, we as believers in the United States can recognize that our world is full of tension and contention and conflict. And it's kind of a pie-in-the-sky approach to think that we're going to do so well in evangelizing the world that all of a sudden we're just going to usher in the return of Jesus. That's the postmillennial view. There are two different forms of the premillennial view. I want to hit these quickly. There's historic premillennialism. The reason it's termed that is it's the view that's been most widely held throughout church history. We're 2,000 years on the other side of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The majority of church history has landed on the historic premillennial view. It's the view that teaches Jesus comes back once, not in two stages. We'll get to the two-stage view here in just a second, but Jesus returns once. At the end of the period of 7 years, or at the end of the tribulation period, Jesus returns and he sets up his kingdom and he initiates the 1,000-year reign. The second view, that's also a premillennial view, is called dispensational premillennialism. The main difference between historic premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism focuses on when the rapture takes place. For those that believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, dispensational premillennialism teaches Jesus comes back in two stages. That he comes back once and he takes his church out of the world before the tribulation period begins. And then he pours out his wrath on the world in judgment. Historical premillennialism teaches Jesus returns once, and he gathers his church together with him at the same time he returns, and he sets up his 1,000-year kingdom. The fourth view, the amillennial view, that little letter A at the beginning of the word millennial, it's a way of saying no millennium. Again, it's kind of the safe landing place. It's a more symbolic approach to the 1,000-year reign. Jesus is going to return and he's going to begin a process of the world being established underneath his authority, but it's not necessarily concrete. The amillennial view is more comfortable interpreting the aspects of the 1,000-year reign symbolically. Those are the four views on the millennium. A third area, and I'm going to hit this very quickly, a third area where we tend to disagree when you come to the book of Revelation, and we've already highlighted a little bit, is how you view the rapture of the church. There are three different landing places traditionally on the rapture of the church. And I've already hinted at this. There are those who believe in the pre-tribulational position that Jesus is going to come back and he's going to take his church out of the world before the 7 years of tribulation. And then there are those who are post-tribulationists. Historic premillennialism are people that believe in the post-tribulational view. Jesus comes back and he raptures his church at the end of the tribulation period and he sets up his kingdom on this earth. One return. And then there are those who kind of split the difference. They're mid-tribulationists. They believe Jesus is going to come back and he's going to rapture his church before the worst of the tribulation takes place. And I know what some of you are thinking. Good gracious, Pastor, why in the world are you giving us all these terms? I can't keep all these straight, so I gave you a handout. But why are you going this? All you're doing is talking about ways we disagree and ways this book is complicated. What do we do with some of this? I'm glad you asked. I want to kind of bring this together. How do we make sense of the fact that some of us, even in this same room, would land a little bit differently on some of these pieces of the book of Revelation? What are some guiding principles for us to hold close to our heart as we make sense of this final book of the Bible and as we prepare to live in the world in the in-between? Three principles I want us to kind of close with and unpack for just a couple of minutes. How do we navigate these differences? First of all, I want to hang here for just a couple of minutes. If many of the most biblically educated of Jesus' day missed his first coming, I believe we should be even more careful how firmly we hold to our convictions of the prophetic future. Now, let me walk through what I mean by that. If you go back into the New Testament period, the Gospels, Jesus is on this earth. The Bible tells us that Jesus was born of a virgin and that he grew in wisdom and stature and that he began his ministry at 30. And the Bible is consistent to tell us in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the Old Testament looking forward to Jesus, and in the rest of the New Testament that looked back at his first coming, the Bible is explicit to tell us who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God, that he is the Savior of sinners, that he was fully man and that he was fully God. Jesus came into a world, he came into a people, his people, the Jewish people. He came to a people who knew the Bible backwards and forwards. He came to a world where the culture of his day, Pharisees and scribes and Sadducees, were people who were thoroughly invested in the truth of the Old Testament scriptures. As a matter of fact, Pharisees traditionally had to have committed at least the first 5 books of the Bible to memory. Think about that just for a second. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all committed to memory. Who would like to raise their hand and begin quoting Genesis chapter 1:1 and finish with Deuteronomy at the end of anybody? Any takers? In Jesus' day, he came into a world and culture of people who were Bible saturated, who knew the Old Testament, many who would have had more than the Old Testament, the first 5 books, committed to memory. These were people who were thoroughly invested in the religious world of Jesus' day. And get this, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes of Jesus' day were standing eye to eye with Jesus. Many of them watched Jesus perform miracles. They stood on the outskirts of his sermons. They were there when he was crucified, and they heard the reports of his resurrection. They saw Jesus face to face. They were as close to Jesus as you and I are today, and they missed his first coming. Let that settle in. These were people who knew that Genesis 3:15 and Isaiah, the servant songs of Isaiah and the Psalms were prophesying about a Messiah. Even Jesus' own disciples, if you go to Luke chapter 24, you'll see a place where Jesus is spending time conversing with 2 of his followers after his resurrection. And the Bible says they were walking on the road to Emmaus, a 7-mile walk, Luke chapter 24, a 7-mile walk, and Jesus came up alongside of them, and he said, "What are you guys discussing?" And they said, "We're discussing about our leader, the man we thought who was the Messiah, and we thought he was come to be our king, and we're not sure what to make of this because he just died." And the Bible says Jesus began to preach to them from all of the scriptures, all of the prophecies concerning himself. He was preaching from the Old Testament, everything the Old Testament had to say about him. And it was only at the end of that conversation that 2 of his followers had their eyes open to see that who they were talking to was Jesus himself. So for us as God's people, when we strive to make sense of the prophetic future, the things that are out on the horizon are out beyond the horizon that we can see. The unfolding of world history from God's perspective that we can only see from our very narrow view. If the most religious of Jesus' day missed his first coming and they were looking at him eye to eye, I just encourage us to be careful how firmly we hold to our convictions about the prophetic future. Now, I want to say this. I've said it already in this series, and I'm going to say it again today, and I'm going to say it as we work our way through the book. My goal in the series of Revelation is not to change your eschatology. I've shared with you a number of these different landing places, and I believe a number of these are valid, and a number are more valid than others. The goal of this series is not to upset your apple cart of eschatology, but it is to remind each and every one of us to be careful how firmly we hold to it. Let me say it this way. Don't you think it would be important if some of us happen to be wrong about our eschatology? Let's just take the rapture for just a second. If we happen to be wrong about the timing of the rapture, don't you think it's important that we've held to it in such a way that if we're wrong about it, we still hold to Jesus? The goal of the Word, the goal of the book of Revelation is that we're locked in on the promise of Jesus' return, not on our view of how best to make sense of the details of Jesus' return. That we're bound to Him and the promise that He's coming back, and that we're locked into that so that whatever unfolds in the in-between, we are locked in with Christ and Christ alone. A second principle that I want us to flesh out for just a moment or two. We should be gracious towards those who hold different views of the end times. I've alluded to this already a couple of times in this morning's message and last week. I believe it's a third level doctrine. I believe some folks are going to land differently on certain parts of how we make sense of Revelation than me. As a matter of fact, I have family members who are in ministry. I can remember back years ago when I was in Bible college, my brother and I were both pursuing a call to ministry, and my dad was a pastor. And we sat around the dinner table and we went back and forth on our eschatology and our end times views, and we were arguing. My mom hated us arguing, which made my dad enjoy it all the more. And we were going back and forth. But do you know what? We left that table still loving one another and recognizing that that's my dad and that's my brother. And even though they were wrong and I was right, graciousness towards those who disagree. My friend that I was telling you about earlier, who was a preterist, he was one of the most convictionally firm believers I've ever been around in my life. He did not hold to a view that he had not read deeply about, and he believed what he believed, and he believed it so fervently, he felt like it was his job to change you. As a matter of fact, I remember many discussions that turned into arguments and debates about all shapes and sizes of theology, including preterism. But I want to share with you something. His name was Todd. He was a dear friend. As a matter of fact, he was such a dear friend, and he meant so much to my wife and I in our relationship with one another, even though we butted heads about what we believed, and even though we disagreed about a number of matters theologically, we loved each other so closely and so deeply, and he had such an impact on us, we named our son after him, Joseph Todd Hefner. We should be loving and gracious towards those who land differently than us on theological views, particularly related to the end times. Then I want you to notice, thirdly, probably most important, the Scriptures plead with us to focus our attention on how we are living now rather than on how things will end. The Scriptures plead with us to focus our attention on how we live now rather than figuring out how things will end. My guess is there's a few of us in this room that have heard a phrase something along the lines of, that person's so heavenly minded they're no earthly good. I've been around some believers whose focus on eschatology and the nature of the end times and the timing of the end times, they were so caught up, borderline obsessed. Maybe some of them were obsessed. They were so caught up with the details and the dates and the processes of the end times that they had lost sight of the fact that they were still living in a world that desperately needed the transforming grace of God to live through them. They were focused on what would happen next or what would happen later or what would happen down the road, and they were so focused on whether or not that happened would happen later, would happen quickly, that they lost the ability to see the responsibilities and the opportunities that God had right in front of them to continue to please Him in day out living. As a matter of fact, if you dig into any of the sections of the New Testament particularly, that deal with the return of Jesus, the focus of those sections of the Scriptures is not to give us a way necessarily to predict or to understand the timing and the unfolding of Jesus' return. It's to teach us how to live in the in-between. Matthew chapter 24. The focus of Jesus' message about His return was preparing His disciples to pay attention and to live well. If you come into the book of Revelation, and man, we are going to see this unfold in the next few months as we slowly work through chapters 2 and 3 and dig into Jesus' message to the churches. I've said it a few times already. One of the key themes of the book of Revelation is this. Jesus is giving instruction and guidance to His churches in tension and turmoil. The reason John penned down the book of Revelation for the churches in what's now modern-day Turkey, the reason he gave those messages to those churches was because they were in pressure from without and turmoil from within. There were sin struggles that they hadn't stepped away from, and there were external pressures from a world that was squeezing in upon them, and as the Roman Empire began to fervently persecute Christians. And John gave the book of Revelation, the prophecies of Revelation, to those churches to hold fast. One of the key themes of the book is the theme of endurance. And what we see so many places in the New Testament, when we get to the emphasis on the return of Jesus, the focus isn't meant to get our eyes just locked into the return, but it's to remind us that he is coming back. It's a guarantee. He's coming again. And it's challenging us. The sections of the scriptures are there to challenge us to live well in the in-between. As a matter of fact, we see that very explicitly if we look at one of the key passages in the New Testament that talks about Jesus' return. Perhaps the most famous of the Apostle Paul's statements on the return of Jesus is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I'm not going to read verses 13 through 20, but I am going to summarize it very quickly. At the end of that chapter, Paul is writing to encourage the church, and he makes this statement. He said, "But I don't want you to be ignorant, brothers, about those who have fallen asleep." Some questions in the church at Thessalonica had come up about what would happen to those who had died, to the believers who had already left this earth and their body was laid into the ground. And Paul was wanting to make sure that the church recognized what God had to say about those who had fallen asleep as believers, about those who had died. And he says, I don't want you to be ignorant about what happens to those who are fall asleep. He said, Jesus is going to return and a trumpet's going to resound and Jesus is going to come back on the clouds, just like what we're reading in Revelation chapter 1. And he said he's going to cry out. When he does, the dead in Christ are going to rise first. And he says those of us who remain will meet him together in the air. And then Paul says something beautiful. He said, therefore, comfort one another with these words. In other words, hold to the concrete truth that one day Jesus is coming back. And if you've died, before he comes back, he's going to wake you up. And you're going to get up out of the ground. What a sight that's going to be to see. Oh, my gracious. Whether or not we want a front row seat to it, we're going to get a front row seat to it. Isn't that amazing? If we're here and Jesus comes back in the twinkling of an eye, every believer who's died is going to be resurrected right in front of our eyes. It's going to happen just like that. If we happen to have already been passed away, we're going to be with Jesus in spirit form, and he's going to bring us back, and he's going to put us back together. I don't know what that's going to look like, but y'all, it's going to be awesome. Paul is wanting us to hold to the promise and to the certainty of it. And then that's why he said, therefore, comfort one another with these words. But I want to go back and read what Paul says in the 4 verses preceding 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 20. Listen to what he begins to say in verse 9. Now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write you. For you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. For that indeed is what you were doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia. Let me pause there for just a second. Paul has been encouraging the church. He's been writing to the church to correct and to instruct and to guide. And he gets to the end of the book as he's finishing up the book and he says, listen, I don't even need to tell you how important love is. Do you want to know why I don't need to tell you how important love is? Because you're loving well. You're not only loving those in your body. The Bible is telling us through Paul that the Thessalonian church was loving those outside the body. They were loving well other believers around the world. Listen, this is so cool. When we as a church come together, and God blesses us to gather together in worship, and God blesses the fruitfulness of your giving and generosity, we have the privilege to bless others all around the world. This past calendar year, we gave more to the Lottie Moon Christmas offering than we've ever given in the history of Pleasant Garden Baptist Church. But we're not the only church that's done that. Southern Baptist Convention International Mission Board has received a record giving to international missionaries all around the world of more than $200 million, all around the country and all around the world to international missions. That's exactly what Paul is identifying. That's exactly the trait that Paul is identifying with the Thessalonian church. You love one another well. You love your Connect ministry well. You love the people you sit beside in church well. You love your neighbors well, but you have loved those outside the four walls well too. You've loved other believers. You've given, you've supported, you've encouraged, you've been generous. Now look at what he continues to say in the middle part of verse 10. But we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more. You've done it well, and I'm saying please keep doing it. Don't give up. Don't stop loving well. Don't stop loving more and more. Look at verse 11. And to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. The focus of Paul's chapter in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 parallels the focus of the whole book of Revelation. The reason we're to hold to the promise and the hope of Jesus' return is so that in the in-between we have our foundation on the right platform, so that in the stuff that we deal with between now and when he comes back, we do exactly what we're commanded to do in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We work with our hands. We take care of ourselves. We aspire to live quietly. We mind our own affairs. What's Paul getting at? Quit your gossiping. Quit stirring up stuff with other people. Live quietly. Mind your own affairs. Work with your hands as we instruct you. Why? So that you will live well before outsiders. Folks, please let's not miss this. We're almost finished this morning, but don't miss this. The reason the scriptures implore us to keep the promise of Jesus' return firmly and hold to the details more loosely is because the stuff we live through in the in-between is where the fabric of our life is tested. It's where the rubber meets the road. The stuff we're dealing with right now, the twists and turns of life, the ups and downs of life, the uncertainties of life, the pains and the frustrations of life, Jesus has put in front of us the promise of his return to give us something to hold to and hold to firmly and to grip it concretely, but to hold to the details loosely. Do you want to know why? Because none of us have control of the details between now and then. Because every single one of us walked into this sanctuary this morning with something that was pushing a button. With some situation or relationship, with some conflict, with some anxiety, with some uncertainty. Every single one of us walked in here with stuff. And Jesus says, I get the fact that that stuff is there. And I want you to focus on holding to me, loving well, and being faithful. Why? Because the testimony of a life well lived through difficulty and challenge and uncertainty is what lets those outside the four walls of this church know we're changed by something bigger than us. Jesus wants to live so beautifully through you and I, through our stuff, that people around us would go, man, I don't get that. That does not make sense. That reaction, that does not make sense. That disposition, that joy, that does not make sense. Because I know if I were going through what they were going through, I know if I were struggling with what they were struggling with, I know if I had just lost what they lost, I know if I were battling what they were battling, I wouldn't have joy, I wouldn't have peace, I wouldn't have confidence, I wouldn't have calm. I'd be spitting out, I'd be throwing up, I'd be frustrated, I'd be venting. But I look at their life and man, they're calm. It's like they're in the middle of a turmoil and they're just at peace. Their face glows with presence and calm and peace and grace. How is that the case? It's the case for some of us who have walked through tough stuff because we're holding to the promise that Jesus has us and He's coming back to get us, and nothing can change that. But in the in-between, we're locked into Him because the only way I have the assurance that I'm going to make it through the stuff I've got in the in-between is that I'm holding to the right thing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a believer, a Christian, a Lutheran pastor and ministry leader who lived in Germany and died in Germany during the time of World War II. He was arrested, jailed, and lost his life under Hitler's regime shortly before World War II ended. He lived in Germany and he watched the atrocities and he watched the evils of a national Third Reich that the German Empire had raised up from within, and he watched it commit grave crimes against entire people groups, the Jewish people among many others. And he watched Hitler do it on the back of a certain language and talk that had some quasi-religious speak to it. And he, along with a number of other believers during that time, saw through and saw Hitler's evil for what it was. What was happening in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's world during the reign and the rule of the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler, a number of believers worldwide, but specifically in the nation of Germany, began to contemplate and wonder whether or not Hitler was the Antichrist. Now, Hitler was certainly an Antichrist, but there was actually speculation about whether or not Hitler was the Antichrist. We read a little bit further into the book of Revelation, you're going to see the descriptions of the leaders of the enemies of God, the dragon and the prophet and the beast. 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, other places talk about the Antichrist that will come to rule. And there were people who were wondering whether or not that was Hitler. So much so that a group of Christians approached Bonhoeffer and they said this: why do you expose yourself? Interestingly enough, Bonhoeffer was so zealous for preserving the believers in Germany, and he so recognized Hitler's evil that he was actually part of a coup to try to overthrow Hitler and assassinate him. That's why he was in jail. That's ultimately why he lost his life. And he was asked by a group of Christians, why do you expose yourself to all this danger? Jesus is going to return any day, and all your work and suffering will be for nothing. And this is what he said: if Jesus returns tomorrow, then tomorrow I will rest from my labor. But today I have work to do. I must continue the struggle until it's finished. Folks, today we have work to do. We must continue the struggle until it's finished. We must see it through to the end. I wish I could stand up here as your pastor and tell you exactly when and what and how of the end times, but I can't. What I can tell you is that Jesus is worth holding on to, and the work's not done, and we all have the opportunity to continue to put His grace and transformation on display for a world that desperately needs the hope we have. And for those of you that walked into this sanctuary this morning with stuff, some of you walked in with stuff that you feel like's heavier than you know how to carry. And Jesus just says, I get it. I'm with you. Hold to me. Endure. I'll walk with you all the way to the end. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes as we prepare for our invitation? Here in just a moment, I have an opportunity to respond. Perhaps someone in this room, listen, you carried some heavy stuff in here, and this morning you just need to bring that stuff back to Jesus and say, Jesus, you got to help me. You got to help me carry it. You got to help me hold to you. I'd love nothing more than to pray with you, our pastoral staff. I'd love nothing more than to pray with you. perhaps maybe you just need to bring it to the altar and take a moment and pray right down here at the front. We would invite you to do that. Maybe you're here this morning and you've never entered into a relationship with Jesus. You don't have the confidence, you don't have the hope that He's holding on to you, because that relationship has never started. And I'd love nothing more than to walk you through beginning a relationship with Him. I encourage you, as we sing, to respond to what God would say to you.